The evening of the 5th of June in 1944 passed like any other along the French coast of Normandy, though nobody standing guard that night could have known it would be their final ordinary sunset. A young German soldier named Heinrich Severloh, holding the rank of Obergefreiter and only 20 years of age, sat in defensive position 62, a fortification the Allied forces would soon designate as part of Omaha Beach, methodically cleaning his MG-42 machine gun. The weapon represented German engineering at its finest, capable of spitting out 1,200 rounds every 60 seconds. Within 24 hours, Severloh would squeeze its trigger enough times to send 12,000 bullets screaming toward American soldiers. Within 24 hours, soldiers on both sides would speak of him in whispered, horrified tones as the Beast of Omaha. But on this quiet evening, he composed a letter to the girl waiting for him back home, describing in mundane detail the rabbit he'd managed to catch and how he planned to cook it for his dinner. The defensive system the Germans called the Atlantic Wall ran along an impossibly long stretch of European coastline, extending 2,400 miles from the frozen shores of Norway all the way down to Spain's warmer waters. The Reich had poured 3.7 billion Reichsmarks into its construction, a sum so staggering that it could have purchased 50,000 fighter aircraft. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who'd seen the fortifications with his own experienced eye, offered a grim assessment that contradicted the propaganda. He called it nothing more than a thin line with absolutely nothing backing it up. Another defender, an 18-year-old grenadier named Franz Gockel, occupied a bunker overlooking the same beach where Americans would soon pour ashore. He'd grown up on a farm in the countryside near Munich, and on this particular evening he made an entry in his personal diary, noting how calm the sea appeared, how the sound of French farmers' cattle drifted to his position on the wind, how the peacefulness reminded him of home. His rifle had exactly 43 rounds. Each American soldier moving toward his position across the dark waters carried 300. Far from the coast, in the Bavarian mountain retreat of Berchtesgaden, Adolf Hitler followed his nightly routine at 9:15, swallowing 2 grains of veronal to help him sleep. He'd given explicit standing orders to his staff that they were forbidden from waking him unless British troops were literally marching through the streets of Berlin. While the Führer, who'd boasted he could predict exactly where the Allied invasion would strike, drifted into sedated slumber, 500 miles away across Europe, 175,000 Allied soldiers were boarding the ships that would carry them to France. At Rommel's command headquarters, the staff gathered not to plan defensive operations, but to celebrate a birthday party for the Chief of Staff, drinking expensive French cognac that cost more than an enlisted man earned in an entire month, 28 Reichsmarks to be precise. The weather outside turned terrible, with storms that seemed to make any amphibious operation impossible, which is exactly why the Germans felt confident enough to celebrate. Rommel himself wasn't even present at his command post. He'd travelled 500 miles back to Germany on what he considered a safe evening, shopping for a birthday gift of shoes for his wife. As the clocks moved toward midnight, the men of the 716th Infantry Division settled into their positions. These weren't Germany's elite soldiers by any measure. The division defending the beaches that would become known as Sword and Juno consisted of men with an average age of 36, soldiers suffering from bad hearts, missing fingers, chronic digestive ailments. The Wehrmacht had classified them as static troops, a bureaucratic designation that meant they were considered fit only for remaining in fixed positions, standing and fighting and dying without retreating. Private Wilhelm Krause served among them despite having flat feet that would have disqualified him from any mobile unit. The military had designated him a Category 4 soldier, unfit for marching, but apparently perfectly suitable for manning a concrete bunker until death found him. He operated an anti-tank gun firing 50mm rounds from defensive nest number 27, with only 16 shells at his disposal. The following day, 300 American Sherman tanks would roll past his inadequate weapon. For every tank Germany's struggling economy managed to produce, American factories turned out 5. For every fighter plane that rolled off German assembly lines, 4 American aircraft took to the skies. The concrete that formed the Atlantic Wall had consumed 20% of all the cement Germany produced in 1943. 17 million cubic meters of it poured into fortifications while German cities lay in bombed-out ruins. The invasion actually began in the first minutes of June 6th, at 16 minutes past midnight, when the initial wave of paratroopers touched down on French soil. A Wehrmacht intelligence officer named Major Friedrich Hein received a telephone call that jerked him from sleep, with frantic reports of enemy Fallschirmjäger landing. He assumed someone was playing a prank, hung up the phone, and went back to bed. Throughout the Normandy region, German radar operators stared at their screens in disbelief as they tracked what appeared to be an approaching armada of 3,000 ships. They dutifully reported what they were seeing, but their commanding officers refused to believe the readings. The officers insisted it had to be window, the aluminum chaff the British dropped to confuse radar. Just another deception tactic. A young private named Klaus Fischer of the 91st Air Landing Division ran through the darkened streets of a French village as American paratroopers descended from the sky all around him, landing in gardens and on rooftops and in the cemetery behind the church. When he burst into his company headquarters gasping out warnings, his lieutenant proved to be thoroughly drunk, slurring orders for Fischer to return to bed and stop panicking, insisting that the real invasion would come at Calais, just as German intelligence predicted. At 1:30 in the morning, the 21st Panzer Division headquarters finally began to stir. This division represented the only tank formation positioned anywhere near the beaches, equipped with 127 tanks. The cost of producing 4 Mark IV Panzers equaled the price of a single P-51 Mustang fighter aircraft, and the following day would see 2,000 Allied fighters patrolling the skies over Normandy, while the Luftwaffe would manage only 100 sorties. Colonel von Oppeln-Bronichowski roused his tank crews from sleep, and they began executing the procedures they'd drilled 100 times. But there was a critical problem. Adolf Hitler had personally assumed control of every panzer division in France, and Wehrmacht regulations dictated that only the Führer himself could authorize their deployment. Hitler remained fast asleep in Berchtesgaden, sedated and unreachable. At Pointe du Hoc, 3 hours into June 6th, 200 American Rangers began scaling the cliffs under German fire. The defenders of the 2nd Battery, 914th Regiment, watched them climb, manning positions around 6 large guns with a caliber of 155 mm, except the guns weren't actually there anymore. Someone had moved them 3 days earlier, leaving behind telephone poles painted to resemble artillery barrels, a deception that had successfully fooled Allied reconnaissance. 200 Rangers would die attacking wooden logs. Lieutenant Stefan Müller, a 22-year-old university student from Dresden, a city that would be incinerated by firebombing in just 8 months, watched the American assault with a mixture of horror and admiration. If he survived the war, he would write about how they climbed like mountain goats while his men threw grenades down at them, and still they kept coming, refusing to stop or retreat. When 5 o'clock arrived, the naval bombardment commenced. 7 battleships, 23 cruisers, and 104 destroyers opened fire simultaneously. The shells they hurled at the German positions cost approximately $30 million every single minute they fired. In defensive Nest 72, a grenadier named Hein Schilling felt his concrete bunker shake and shudder as if caught in an earthquake. Concrete dust filled his lungs until he choked. Blood began running from his ruptured eardrums. He was 17 years old. He'd volunteered just 6 months earlier over his mother's desperate objections, ignoring her tearful pleas that the war was already lost and he shouldn't die for a cause beyond saving. Each 16-inch shell fired from the USS Texas cost $800, while a German private earned 720 Reichsmarks annually. 1 minute of the bombardment cost more than the Luftwaffe paid to build a Messerschmitt fighter. Obergefreiter van der Kramer crouched in his bunker praying, though not to God. He prayed to the concrete itself, whispering, "Please hold, please hold." Slave labourers had spent 6 months building the bunker, 300 men working under brutal conditions, and 40 of them had died during construction, their bodies mixed into the very concrete Kramer now begged to protect him. A 14-inch shell penetrated the roof. The bunker held for 6 seconds before it ceased to exist. As dawn broke at 10 minutes before 6, Heinrich Severloh peered through his weapon sights and saw them coming. 34 landing craft approached his position. He sat in defensive nest 62 with a perfect field of fire, his MG-42 already loaded with a belt holding 250 rounds. 40 years after the war, when he'd become an old man, he would describe how he could see their faces, young faces that looked remarkably like his own. He squeezed the trigger and the machine gun erupted with a sound like heavy canvas being torn apart, firing 20 bullets every second. The Americans called it Hitler's buzzsaw, and now they were learning why. The first wave died in the water. Severloh changed the gun's barrel because the metal grew so hot it glowed red. He had 12,000 rounds of ammunition at his disposal, more than entire platoons received on the Eastern Front. Each individual round cost 1.2 Reichsmarks to manufacture. By noon, he would have fired 14,400 marks worth of bullets, equivalent to 20 years of salary for a factory worker, all expended in just 4 hours of continuous firing. Grenadier Franz Gockel fired his rifle steadily until sand jammed the mechanism and rendered it useless. With no cleaning kit available, he resorted to throwing grenades, Model 24 stick grenades that cost 12 Reichsmarks apiece to produce. American grenades cost $2 each, and the Americans threw 5 grenades for every one the Germans could manage. Later, if he survived to write about it, Gockel would describe how the Americans kept advancing like a grey-green carpet unrolling toward the German positions. The defenders killed the first wave, then the second, and then the third wave walked forward over the bodies of their fallen comrades without hesitation. On Sword Beach, at 6:30, the British were already pushing inland. Feldwebel Anton Wunsch commanded a platoon of 31 men responsible for defending 1,200 metres of beachfront. They possessed a single anti-tank gun with 6 rounds. 40 British tanks landed in the first wave alone. Wunsch was 43 years old, a baker from Hamburg, whose bakery had been destroyed in the firestorm that consumed his city in July of 1943. His wife and daughters had burned alive in that inferno. Now he fired his inadequate weapon at British tanks, an effort as futile as throwing stones. A Sherman tank cost $50,000 to build. His anti-tank round cost 38 Reichsmarks. The biblical story of David and Goliath played out in reverse, except this Goliath brought overwhelming numbers of friends. A private named Hans Müller, and there were 40,000 soldiers named Hans Müller serving in the Wehrmacht, ran away from the beach into the village of Colleville. He was 16 years old, having lied about his age to enlist. His unit ceased to exist 12 minutes into the battle. He hid in a French barn where a British soldier discovered him 3 hours later and offered him chocolate. Real chocolate made from actual cocoa, not the sawdust bars German soldiers received in their rations. At 7 in the morning, the German High Command still refused to wake Hitler from his sleep. Field Marshal Keitel, terrified of the Führer's legendary rage, declared that this couldn't possibly be the real invasion. He insisted the genuine attack would come at Calais, exactly as German intelligence had predicted. 175,000 Allied soldiers were already ashore in Normandy. Yet Keitel ordered the 15th Army to remain at Calais, 200,000 men waiting for an invasion that would never materialize. The 21st Panzer Division finally received permission to move at 9 o'clock, 6 hours too late to make any meaningful difference. Hitler had awakened and granted authorization for the tanks to deploy. Major von Luck led his battle group towards Sword Beach, his vehicles consuming 300 litres of fuel for every 100 kilometres they travelled. That fuel cost the Reich more than its weight in gold because Germany lacked natural petroleum reserves and had to manufacture synthetic fuel from coal, a process requiring 4.5 tons of coal to produce just 1 ton of usable fuel. His tank battalion would burn more fuel in this single day than a typical German town consumed in an entire month. As they drove through Caen, French civilians lined the streets waving, though not at the German tanks. They were waving at the Allied aircraft filling the sky above. A Panzer IV tank cost 300,000 Reichsmarks to build. A Typhoon rocket cost £30. 8 rockets could destroy a tank. This was the mathematics of modern warfare, an equation the Germans were losing. Obergefreiter Kurt Zimmermann watched the first Typhoon dive toward his position, thinking it resembled a hawk swooping on prey. The rockets struck, and his tank, representing 300,000 Reichsmarks of German engineering and craftsmanship, became worthless scrap metal. He survived, though with burns covering 60% of his body. The morphine required to treat his injuries cost more than his monthly salary. By noon on Omaha Beach, Heinrich Servalow's ammunition was nearly exhausted. His hands were burned from repeatedly changing the overheated barrel, his fingers so numb he couldn't feel them anymore. Americans surrounded his position, behind him and above him. His lieutenant lay dead, his spotter lay dead. He fired his final ammunition belt, destroyed the gun's breech to prevent its capture, and ran. Historians would later calculate that Servalow possibly killed or wounded 2,000 American soldiers. The bullets he fired had cost 17,000 Reichsmarks total, working out to 8.5 marks per casualty inflicted. It represented the cheapest killing in military history, measured purely by cost per death. All along Omaha Beach, German positions fell one by one. They didn't fall to superior courage or tactical brilliance. They fell to mathematics. 10 Americans for every defender. 100 rounds of ammunition for every German bullet. Naval shells that cost more than houses. Unteroffizier Philipp Miller, another one of the countless Millers in Wehrmacht ranks, surrendered at 2 in the afternoon. His bunker was surrounded with only 8 men surviving from the original 40. He waved a piece of white cloth torn from a dead soldier's shirt. An American sergeant confiscated his pistol and offered him a cigarette, a lucky strike made with real tobacco instead of the cabbage leaves Germans smoked. The battle at Utah Beach had effectively ended by 4 in the afternoon, having been over for hours. The 709th Division, composed of what the Wehrmacht called stomach troops, men suffering from ulcers and various digestive disorders, surrendered en masse. Grenadier Josef Engelhardt threw his rifle away and walked toward the Americans with his hands raised high. He was 51 years old, drafted just 2 months earlier from his peacetime job as a streetcar conductor in Munich. He'd never fired his weapon at an enemy soldier. An American medic treated his shrapnel wounds with real sulfur powder and actual bandages, not the paper and sawdust substitutes the German Medical Corps used. The medical supplies expended on German wounded this single day cost more than building a Luftwaffe fighter plane. At 6 in the evening near Bénouville Bridge, Major Hans Schmidt watched British gliders landing one after another, dozens of them, each delivering 30 fresh soldiers. He had 12 men remaining, 2 machine guns, and approximately 100 rounds of ammunition. He thought of Frederick the Great's military wisdom. He who defends everything defends nothing. The Atlantic Wall had attempted to defend everything, 2,400 miles of coastline, 15,000 fortified positions, 500,000 obstacles placed in the water and on the beaches. None of it mattered in the end. The Allies had simply gone around obstacles, flew over them, or smashed straight through them. German 7th Army headquarters received the devastating reports at 8 in the evening. General Dolman read through assessment after assessment. Catastrophe at every beach. The 716th Division had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The 352nd Division reported 60% casualties. The 709th had surrendered. 20,000 German soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured in a single day of combat. Dolman telephoned Field Marshal von Rundstedt to report that the Atlantic Wall had been broken. Rundstedt's response was blunt and fatalistic. Then we have lost the war. At 9 in the evening, hundreds of German prisoners sat in the sand at a collection point on Omaha Beach. Their grey uniforms blended with the grey sand. Obergefreiter Friedrich Dauer, a 22-year-old theology student, watched landing craft continuing to bring more Americans ashore, wave after wave after wave of them. He turned to the man sitting beside him and said they'd never had a chance. The other man was crying, a 17-year-old boy from Saxony who kept repeating that he wanted to go home, that he wanted his mother. An American guard gave them water, clean water from a 5-gallon can that cost more to manufacture and ship across the Atlantic than a German rifle cost to build. The guard was 19 years old, from Iowa, speaking no German but sharing his chocolate anyway. The Germans still held the city of Caen at 11 that night. They would continue holding it for 6 more weeks. Lieutenant Colonel von Rosen stood amid the ruins of a church that British naval shells had reduced to rubble. Each shell had cost $1,000. The church had stood for 800 years and was obliterated in 8 minutes. His battalion, the 125th Panzergrenadier Regiment, had lost half its strength, 300 men, in 1 day of fighting. No replacements were coming because Germany had run out of men. The military was drafting 16-year-old children and 50-year-old grandfathers. The barrel was scraped empty. The following morning at 6 o'clock, Obergefreiter Heinrich Severloh lay on a stretcher in a German field hospital in Bayeux. The Beast of Omaha had been captured while attempting to reach German lines. His hands were wrapped in paper bandages because there was no morphine to spare, all the morphine having been sent to the Eastern Front. A French nun gave him water and whispered in French that the war was over for him. He thought about all the Americans he'd killed, boys just like himself from places he would never see, Iowa and Texas and New York. Many years later, he would meet some of the men who'd survived his machine gun fire. They would forgive him. He would never forgive himself. On the 7th of June, British forces were loading prisoners onto ships bound first for England, then Canada, then America. Gefreiter Walter Hausmann stood in line waiting his turn. He was 20 years old, a carpenter from Bavaria who'd fought for 6 hours before surrendering when his ammunition ran out. A British guard counted the prisoners and gave each one a blanket, a wool blanket worth 30 marks in Germany, if you could even find one for sale. The guard spoke German and informed Hausmann that he was going to Canada where he would be safe. Safe. Hausmann couldn't remember the last time he'd felt safe. He thought about his father's final letter advising him that if he must surrender, he should surrender to the Americans, or British, never to the Russians. On the 10th of June, the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich moved toward Normandy. They were angry because partisan fighters had killed their battalion commander, and they wanted revenge. They selected a village at random, Oradour-sur-Glane, which held 642 civilians, including women and children and babies. The SS locked them inside a church, machine-gunned them, and burned them alive. Sturmbannführer Adolf Diekmann ordered the massacre, calling it reprisal and justice. 2 weeks later, he was dead, killed by an American artillery shell that cost $42 to manufacture. His men fought to the bitter end in Normandy. After word of Oradour spread, no one on the Allied side took SS prisoners. By the 15th of June, fighting had intensified around Hill 112, an area soldiers called Death Valley. Grenadier Ernst Huber of the 12th SS Hitler Jugend was 16 years old, having volunteered at 14 because he believed in the Führer and believed in ultimate victory. His belief shattered when he experienced Allied artillery bombardment. If he survived to write about it, he would describe how it felt like the earth itself was exploding. Older soldiers who'd fought at Stalingrad told him this was worse. British guns fired 20,000 shells in 6 hours, $800,000 worth of ammunition expended in a single bombardment. His company started the day with 140 boys and ended with 30. He surrendered when a Canadian tank crushed his machine gun position. The Canadians didn't shoot him despite his SS runes. He was just a child. Operation Goodwood commenced on the 18th of July with the British carpet-bombing German positions. 2,000 heavy bombers participated, each Lancaster costing £45,000 to build, more expensive than 50 Panzer tanks. They dropped 7,000 tons of bombs, enough explosive power to level an entire city. Panzer Commander Hauptmann Hans von Luck survived inside his tank, barely. He would later recall how the earth danced and tanks were thrown around like toys and men simply disappeared. His company lost 18 of its 22 tanks, 5.4 million Reichsmarks worth of armoured vehicles destroyed in 20 minutes. On the 20th of July, at Hitler's Wolfslair headquarters in East Prussia, Colonel von Stauffenberg's bomb exploded in an assassination attempt. Hitler survived. The Wehrmacht's last realistic chance to end the war died in that moment. In Normandy, soldiers heard the news over their radios. Lieutenant Wolfgang Fischer of the 21st Panzer wrote in his diary that if Germans couldn't kill their own monster, the Americans would do it for them. Operation Cobra began on the 25th of July, with the Americans finally achieving their breakthrough. 3,000 aircraft participated, including 1,500 heavy bombers. Each B-17 cost $238,000 to manufacture, the equivalent of a small city's worth of aircraft concentrated in one offensive. They transformed the German front line into a lunar landscape. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, commanding Panzer Lehr Division, sent a report stating that his division had been annihilated, his men either dead or wounded or driven insane by the bombing, 70% casualties inflicted by bombs costing $50 each. Mathematics determined who won wars. Hitler ordered a counter-offensive at Mortain on the 7th of August, demanding his forces attack and drive the Allies back into the sea. 4 panzer divisions, representing Germany's last reserves in France, attacked under cover of darkness. Fog covered their advance, and for 6 hours German commanders dared to believe they might actually succeed. Then dawn arrived, the fog lifted, and Typhoon fighter bombers appeared in the sky. Unteroffizier Karl Heinzen of the 2nd Panzer Division watched his battalion destroyed, describing later how the aircraft came in waves and their beautiful tanks, each worth 300,000 marks, were destroyed by rockets that seemed to cost nothing at all. The 19th of August found 200,000 German soldiers trapped in what became known as the Falaise Pocket. The entire 7th Army was caught in the trap. The road to escape became 10 miles of pure death as Allied artillery transformed it into a slaughterhouse that soldiers called the Corridor of Death. Obergefreiter Wilhelm Becker abandoned everything, his rifle and pack and dignity, and simply ran. He stepped over dead horses and dead men and burning tanks. A Tiger tank worth 600,000 Reichsmarks of perfect German engineering burned beside the road with its crew still trapped inside, cooked alive. General Eisenhower visited the battlefield afterward and stated that it was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. 50,000 Germans didn't escape the pocket. 10,000 died and 40,000 were captured. Paris was liberated on the 25th of August when General von Choltitz surrendered the city intact, defying Hitler's explicit orders to burn it to the ground. Hitler screamed into the telephone demanding to know if Paris was burning. It wasn't. Von Choltitz understood the war was lost and saw no point in destroying beauty to satisfy a madman's rage. By the 30th of August, the first German prisoners from D-Day arrived at their final destination, Camp 165 in Caithness, Scotland. Unteroffizier Georg Meyer stared in disbelief at what he was given. Real meat 3 times per week. White bread, actual butter, more food than German civilians had seen in 2 years. He wrote home that prisoners were eating better than their families, but the letter was censored because authorities couldn't let Germans know their captured soldiers ate like kings while Germany starved. Throughout September of 1944, camps across Britain and North America received 300,000 German prisoners from Normandy alone. They were shipped to Britain, Canada, and America. Gefreiter Hans Weber arrived at Boston Harbor and saw the lights, miles and miles of lights, with no blackout, no bomb shelters, no fear. He would write decades later that they knew then, in that moment seeing the lights, that they never had a chance. The Americans could build ships faster than Germany could sink them, planes faster than they could be shot down. The Americans had everything, while Germany had only will, and will didn't stop bullets. At Camp Hearn in Texas, Obergefreiter Fritz Müller picked cotton for wages of 80 cents per day, more money than he'd made as a soldier. The American guards proved friendly, sharing cigarettes and teaching him English. One guard told him he was lucky because the war was over for him. Müller thought about his brother fighting on the Eastern Front, wondering if he was still alive, and about his parents in Hamburg, wondering if Hamburg still existed. Yes, he thought, I am lucky. German prisoners in Camp Concordia, Kansas, celebrated Christmas of 1944 with a real Christmas tree, decorations and gifts. American families sent presents to enemy prisoners, cookies and scarves and books. Feldwebel Johann Schmidt couldn't comprehend it. He told his barracks mates that the Americans treated them better than their own government had treated them, and they were the enemy. He didn't know that back in Germany his family received no rations that Christmas because the Reich was saving food for the troops, what few troops remained. Victory in Europe Day arrived on the 8th of May, 1945. The war in Europe ended. In prisoner camps across America, German soldiers listened to radios announcing that Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Their homeland lay in ruins. 8 million Germans were dead. Every major city had been destroyed. Gefreiter Werner Friedman sat in Camp Shelby, Mississippi. He was 21 years old, captured on D-Day, having spent 11 months in America where he'd learned English and learned to love jazz and learned that everything the Nazis had told him about America was a lie. He told his friend that they'd fought for the wrong side. His friend nodded. By then, they all knew it. Between 1946 and 1948, repatriation proceeded slowly. The prisoners went home to ruins. Obergefreiter Heinrich Severloh returned to find his village occupied by British forces, his father dead, his family farm reduced to rubble. He never spoke about what he'd done on Omaha Beach. The Beast of Omaha became a peaceful farmer and died in 2006, still haunted by memories. Thousands of prisoners never returned to Germany at all. They stayed in America, married American women, became American citizens. Gefreiter Hans Weber opened a bakery in Milwaukee where he made real bread, not the sawdust bread of wartime Germany. His customers never knew he'd once aimed a machine gun at their sons. On the 6th of June, 1984, the 40th anniversary of D-Day, old men returned to Normandy. Americans, British, Canadians and Germans too. They shook hands on the beaches where they'd once tried to kill each other. Franz Gockel met Robert Williams, who'd been in the first wave at Omaha while Gockel was shooting at him. They embraced and both cried, old men who'd been boys with guns, frightened children told to kill each other. Gockel said they were all just children, frightened children with guns. The Atlantic Wall ultimately cost 17 billion Reichsmarks, enough money to feed Germany for 2 years, or build 100,000 fighter aircraft. It held for exactly 1 day. The German defenders were ordinary men, bakers and teachers and farmers, grandfathers and children, told they were defending civilization and told they were heroes. They were just men trapped in concrete boxes facing an ocean of steel. They fired until ammunition ran out, fought until positions were overrun, died for a cause that was already lost. 20,000 fell on the first day, dying for nothing. The war's outcome was decided in Detroit's factories, not on Normandy's beaches, in the oil fields of Texas rather than in the bunkers of France. Today, grass grows over those bunkers. Tourists take selfies where boys bled to death. The Atlantic Wall stands as a curiosity, concrete tombstones marking an empire's delusions. Heinrich Severloh's position still exists. Visitors can stand where he stood and see what he saw. the beach and the sea and the horizon where the ships first appeared. They can imagine the sound of 20 rounds per second, Hitler's buzzsaw. Now there's only wind and seagulls. The last German defender of Omaha Beach died in 2020. Franz Gockel lived to 94 years old and spent his final years visiting schools, telling children that war is not glory, war is boys dying in sand. Learn from us, never again. Never again became the prayer of every soldier who survived, American and British and Canadian and German too. They all learned the same lesson. War is arithmetic. The side with the most ships and planes and tanks and bullets wins. Courage doesn't matter, will doesn't matter, mathematics matters. The Atlantic Wall was the most expensive fortification in human history, and it failed in one day because you cannot build walls against mathematics, you cannot fortify against industrial might. Detroit's assembly lines defeated Berlin's bunkers. That's not a story, that's accounting, but 20,000 German boys paid the bill in blood.